That should work. Now, the next thing that I have to try is sharing my screen. And go to this and go to my slideshow. So the intention with GIST, as people probably know, is to provide a shareable model that can be used for modeling enterprise ontologies. But the other thing is that what we're looking at also is to see whether or not we can improve in a continuous way our ontology engineering so that we're demonstrating best practices. And the other thing that we're interested in, as you can see with the GIST Council, but with other events that we run, is the branding of GIST and the use of it in terms of thought leadership. And with the use of GIST, the expectation is that people will be able to get their ontology projects started much more quickly, avoid the rookie mistakes, and then through the community that we're developing with the GIST Council to network and to learn from peers. And this is where I think it's really important that people talk a little bit about what it is that they're using GIST for, so that we know who to talk to within this small community if we are moving into that sort of area, and perhaps buddy up with people in order to ensure that we have a convergent evolution and that we're able to highlight the best practices and perhaps document those as we go forward. Next thing is that we've got a semantic arts side of this in terms of our commitment, and that is to make sure that we make GIST permanently available in every version, and that we look after things like change requests in a well-organized way, so that people can follow the trail of evidence as to why certain proposals were adopted and what the discussion is. And what we would like is for people to use GIST, to keep it in the GIST and Semantic Arts namespace, and to ensure that they abide by the Creative Commons share-alike attribution. But as we've heard from Ted, if you can't keep to these sorts of things, there is the option to pay and buy, and that then gives you the ability to change things as you want. So the background to GIST is that it's a minimalist upper ontology that's developed and maintained by Semantic Arts with the following design principles: that we have a maximum coverage of typical business concepts with the fewest number of primitives and the least amount of ambiguity. And I've mentioned the license before. And what I would like to start off the council meeting today with is a whistle-stop tour of version 9.2 that was released on the 30th of April and is available from the standard Semantic Arts GIST webpage. There's a direct link from which you can import into tools like Protégé. And there is also a link for a download for the zip file of all the different files in the GIST release. I'm also kind of teeing up colleagues for a little bit later on in this, because there are certain discussions that we've had about design issues, and I would like to invite colleagues at the appropriate time maybe to have a little bit of an expose of what the thinking was around how some of the changes that have been brought in version 9.2 were decided upon. Now, the development process is managed on GitHub And anyone could submit an issue, but again, as part of the overall approach to continuous improvement here, what we want to be making sure of is that there's an attention to the process and that people who are submitting issues actually take a look and check that they're not duplicating stuff that's already there. And as a reminder, within the documentation on the GitHub, there is a small set of instructions with regard to contributing to GIST. And I would invite you all to take a look at that, to follow it. And if you see any things that could be improved, to follow the issue submission route and bring your suggestions into the mix. So I've organized the changes in version 9.2 into 3 groupings. The first one of which I just generally call niggles. And so we've corrected 3 classes of niggle in 9.2. The first one is that we have replaced the XS namespace prefix for the more standard XSD namespace prefix. The second one is that we have converted the gist minute convert to base value from 1 to 60. And the third one that we've dealt with is correcting a bunch of typos and misspellings and so on. The next set of changes in version 9.2 relate to things like documentation and the process of creating the GIST deliverables. So we have begun to improve the quality of the tooling that we use to package up GIST. And that means that there were defunct tools and documentation on the use of those. So they've been removed. We have begun to develop better a style guide, things like how to organize the camel cases for classes and for properties and so on. And the approach that we're taking to abbreviations and other things like that. So you can find out about that again in the documentation. We're also making the change and release management much more formal, better documented. The guidelines for submission of issues and pull requests are also documented. And then within the previous versions of GIST, you'll have seen reference to other defunct tools, including things like E6 and so on, and we've removed those. The final thing then are a set of changes with regard to the design. The first one of those is that GIST core was supposed to be able to directly import all the GIST modules. That wasn't working properly. That's been fixed. And the final one, which was something started several months ago by a suggestion from Ted, is that we have made some changes to cardinality restrictions and made disjoint certain GIST units. There's been quite a bit of discussion on this, and I was wondering at this stage if perhaps Michael and Dahlia would like to talk about how we decided on what we ended up with, which is making distance and duration and mass all disjoint and making sure that distance unit and area unit had a cardinality of 1. Dahlia, do you want to jump in?
Yep, yes, I can. I'm trying to recall this properly. So one thing we did end up adding used to be that area units was defined as a multiplier of any distance units by and a multiplicand of some distance units, in which case you could basically define area to be a volume instead. Like you can multiply as many distances by each other, which is obviously not correct. So we restricted those to be one multiplier and one multiplicand. So you can only have meter by meter, foot by foot, or etc. And same with volume. And for the other one, we decided to add disjoints because as I was kind of playing around with that, I noticed that it would very easily make wrong inferences. So it would infer that a meter is equal to a second if you try to put that an area is meter by second. So because of that, we decided to make all of the base units to be disjoints from each other. Because obviously you can't have a distance unit that's also a duration unit or also a mass unit. And we decided to keep that only to the base units and not extend that to the ratio or product units, because you can basically infer that they're disjoint as you move up, so that you don't need to add so many disjoints for every single ratio or product unit that you define.
Thank you very much. Michael, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Not really. That was pretty clear, and it accords with my memory. One thing we did also do was avoided having disjoints expressed both directions. So we just expressed. So if duration unit is disjoint from mass unit, there was some mix-up where we sometimes had it going the other way also. So that's been cleaned up.
Okay. And Ted, is this hitting all the points that you feel needed to be addressed?
I believe you're muted, Ted.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I could see myself talking. But yes, this addresses my original concern and several other concerns that were clearly lurking as well. The main concern is that in work for Morgan Stanley, I have to deal with energy as a commodity, buying and selling electricity, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself. And there, according to the SI system of international units, there are 2 ways to arrive at energy, and both formulas were used in the text I was analyzing, and the restrictions that were originally in GIST insisted that you could only have one formula for calculating energy. So now that restriction is gone. GIST now more accurately conforms to reality, and I am happy.
So how do you plan, if we make changes to GIST in the public version, but you've got a private version, how do you deal with changes within your area?
There is a group of people within Morgan Stanley. They call themselves the Ontology and Semantic Modeling Consortium. And one of their main purposes, it's primarily a governance group, and one of their main purposes is to make sure that the private label version of GIST tracks the publicly available version. And there's been discussion about upgrading to version 9, which will have significant impact. In other words, updating the MS core, the Morgan Stanley core ontology, to be based on GIST 9. There's major impact, if nothing else, because of the switch to the HTTPS URL,
Yes.
which will affect all triples, and there are hundreds of thousands of triples in production databases. So there will be a lot of data reloading. And the consortium, I think, sensibly decided that this change should be done near the end of the year, when other types of production-related code changes are put on hold. It will give the staff time to work on this, make the transition, because, you know, at one level, it doesn't have a lot of immediate business value to move from, I think we're on just 7 right now to just 9. On the other hand, everybody knows it's important. So scheduling it near the end of the year was a good way of compromising between delivering business value by working on other ontology changes and taking advantage of the opportunity at the end of the year when the work is slow to get the changes in. So that's our target. We should be up to date by the end of this year.
Right, okay.
Well, hey, Peter, before you leave this slide, I just wanted to say a word or two about the first bullet. So if we're done with this bullet, was this the issue where the turtle version in Protege didn't transitively import everything, and we said to support that we're just going to point core at everything? Is that what that is? Does anyone know?
It did import everything, but
No, I've been busy. Sorry.
Go ahead, Peter.
Sorry, who's speaking here?
If I recall the discussion, we just decided that the imports should be made explicit.
I was going to suggest that too, but it's just after work.
That's correct. It was importing everything, but it would do it indirectly through the other GIST modules. And the decision was just to import everything directly and explicitly.
Because in particular, the documentation said that GIST core would import everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, it did, although I think there was some issues. The turtle version in Protege, for some reason, didn't do transitive closure. So I assume that's what you were trying to fix there.
Yeah, Dave, I've been, you know, in the ontology, the Morgan Stanley Research Ontology, I have rather deep nesting of imports, and transitive closure works every time, and everything's in turtle. So maybe that's an old Protege problem that's gone away, but it sounds like that wasn't the motivation here anyway. I don't know.
This issue arose with FIBO when I was working with them. They decided to have every single ontology explicitly import every ontology that it needed, even instead of having a chain of transitive imports. It was just a decision that they made. They acknowledged that there's redundancy there, but they felt that it had some overriding benefits. For example, when you look at ontology, you immediately know what's in there instead of having to chase all around lots of links. It can work either way, and we used to do it by having transitive imports, and we decided to go the other way.
So I'm just looking back at the issue itself, and of course this is one of the advantages of storing all this discussion in the GitHub repository, so that anybody can go and look and understand the history and motivation behind our decision. So one of the points being made was that it's a less error-prone approach if intermediate imports change. I think that's an important one.
I've always found it a problem with Protege that you make a change and then you save it, and then you find out that you saved it to the wrong ontology.
That's a different problem. That's true.
I hate that. Yep.
But it's related, because if you centralize the imports, then it becomes straightforward to open a single ontology at a time, or all of them as you choose.
Yeah.
A single for editing, you know, or all the or imports.
And while this is not so much an issue with GIST itself, I think it's a good practice, because this way you do know, even before you fire up an ontology, what you are importing, what you're bringing along. So, if for some reason, something that you were importing was transitively importing FOF or something, and you really didn't want that in your ontology, you would be aware of that from the beginning. If everything is listed as a direct import.
That's an interesting point. Is this going to go into the style guide? As it sounds like it should.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's one of the things that will go in, that ought to be in the style guide. I'll just point out about the style guide. It's in a very embryonic state right now. We just did a couple of things, and it's not much of a guide at the current time, but it will be growing as we attack new issues and make decisions.
So I think that the other thing that we can do with points like this when it comes to the style guide is that we want to have as much automated validation of styles as possible. So I think that it's probably an idea, Ted, to start off an issue here so that we can track and follow it up with not only written documentation, but also, as I mentioned earlier, we're improving the tool chain when it comes to the production, the bundling of the ontology, and if we can have various automated tests in that, it makes sure that that these sort of proposals persist, people take notice of them. Is there anything else that people would like to discuss about this design aspect of the changes in version 9.2?
On the style guide, is this primarily a style guide for people trying to contribute stuff to GIST, or is it more about ontology design in general, or will it sort of be applicable?
The style guide is mainly about at the moment things like naming of classes and properties, use of abbreviations and things like that. But I think that it's the sort of thing that will spread out a little bit to cover many dimensions of style, including various sort of quality metrics and things of that sort.
Well, like I mentioned, it's in a very nascent state. Of course, it's got 2 or 3 things in it. Of course, the intention is for it to grow, to cover more areas. However, it is meant as a style guide for GIST. It's not necessary, in part, just to create consistency across GIST. It's not necessarily, in some cases, there is no better or worse way of doing something. We're just looking for a convention to standardize things. So I wouldn't say in all cases, these are recommendations in general for designing and implementing ontologies.
I mean, but to some extent, we do consider these to be best practices as determined internally to us. So if you're building ontologies on top of GIST, it would make sense to reduce confusion and follow the same conventions if you're looking for a style guide, if you have not yet established your own.
True.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, that anything founded on GIST might as well more or less conform to GIST, as much as the case will allow.
Why don't we promote them as pretty good practices?
Yes. So
I like that.
I like that much better than best.
Oh.
I want to see the better practices and the worst practices.
This is
always
included intentions right at the beginning, where we talked about it being a place where we can evolve and demonstrate best practices, and also where we can develop thought leadership. Okay, so these are baked into the intentions of GIST. And what we're talking about is making these concrete in the work that we do. Okay, I will move on to something again, which is just a quick review of where we've got to. And what I've been having a look at over the past 24 releases of GIST is the way in which certain classes have appeared and disappeared, certain object properties and data properties have appeared and disappeared. And in these sort of very Greeked out things, if you track from left to right, what you see is the continuation or the discontinuation of certain classes as we have gone through the different releases of GIST, the classes and the object properties and the data properties. But in spite of quite a bit of churn, one of the other things that's quite interesting is how we always tend to hang around somewhere around the 130 to 140 classes, irrespective of the version that we've got. So things have kind of come and gone. And what I'm interested in here is to begin to get the material in so that people can sort of take a look at stuff, but also so that we can begin to work out where it is that we're actually going. Because when we talk about a minimalist upper level ontology, there's a lot of benefit in it being of practical size, something that you can actually get your head around. And this, I think, is absolutely fundamental to the notions of data-centric architecture and the pushback against as Dave puts it, the tyranny of enterprise applications, where we end up with something that's just far too large a data model for any ordinary human to get their head around it. And so I was just wanting to show this as a kind of starter and to start discussion going for the next 20 minutes, perhaps, maybe 15 minutes. We're moving along, but I would like people to have some thoughts, reflections, recollections about how they have found working with the past few versions of GIST, and whether they see that we're homing in on something that's likely to be stable enough so that we don't need to have lots of change and lots of versions. I just want to throw that one out there as being, at what point do we say that we've got it good enough for the work that we're doing?
Yeah, no, I just saw this chart for the first time last night. I was very fat. Obviously, I've lived through this whole thing, and you can I had two reactions. The first one, this little chart here, you can see there's kind of a natural inclination for something like this to grow over time. You think of new things, it's accretive, you add it. You can obviously see there's a couple of releases where we decided to prune, you whack it back, and it grows again. And some of these little growth spurts were whole new modules, Internet of Things added some stuff and stuff like that. And so, I happen to think we're going to probably add a bit more. So we may have to prune a bit more if we want to keep it to this size. The other thing, when you look at these detail green things on the left, which Peter distributed internally, we could ship those around. It's kind of embarrassing and nostalgic, and I don't know what, to see these classes kind of come and go. You think, God, what was I thinking? But it is kind of nostalgic. And some of them are name changes. The class stayed around, but it changed its name, so it looks like, well, it did literally come and go. But
Peter, do you have access? Can you do you have a slide which shows one or two of these examples, just so people can get a sense of what it's? Because it's hard to just look at the green splotches and get an idea how cool what you did is.
Yeah, I can do that, Michael. Let me see. Right.
While Peter's pulling that up too, though, one of the things I would like to note is that internally to semantic arts, we talked about reducing or focusing on reducing not so much the classes as the properties, because now that we have an installed base at a number of different clients in different business domains and everything, it would be fascinating to go in and see which are the properties that we're really using a lot versus the ones that just never seem to get used much. when in the actual T-box data. So I would anticipate that at some point down the road, we'll see a drop in the number of properties in GIST.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So I think that the point that I'm trying to make here is that I think that through some sort of automated analysis of where we've been, what we've done, it makes it easier for us to view big pictures and to be reflective in our practice. And the problem with being reflective in our practice is that we have short cycles which are easy to be reflective in, and long cycles which are actually very difficult to be reflective in, because we don't stick around as the same size of group. A lot of history gets lost. Sometimes the history is, it would take you a long time to kind of go through all the stories, but I think that they're really important to have. I'm showing the detail of the classes slide here for Michael. Is there anything you would like to say about this, Michael, or do you just want me to show that this is indeed stuff that we can...
Just to highlight a couple of things here. So on the top there, we have a class called Agent on Behalf of, which we used for a while, and then we decided that was just kind of like, well, we don't need that. But what's interesting is some of these things go right the way across, and they're the core things that have been around for a long time. Agreement, for example. And if you go down a few more, building, I think, has been there forever. Collection has been there forever.
Content.
Category has been there forever. Content has been there forever.
Yeah, but other things like computer program went along and then just disappeared.
It's coming back. I'm working on it right now. We'll have a new name, though.
Yeah.
We'll have a new name.
I mean,
actually kind of
concept suddenly appears in 7 point something. Yeah.
Which one is that?
Concept, I think.
Concept, yeah. Yeah.
Well, now, artifact is an interesting one. That's row 10. It was there for quite a long time, disappeared for a while, and then it's back. Dave, do you remember anything about that? I'm putting you on the spot here. I realize that. Sorry.
It came back in the Internet of Thing.
Oh, I see. Interesting. Yeah.
Left for a while and somewhere.
You know, I would love to have that spreadsheet. If you can share it, that would be fantastic. But I just want to make two observations. One, first of all, and I think we have at least one faculty member here, I think it would be a great master's thesis to write a paper about the history of GIST and all of the nuances that come out of this history. You know, why did a class disappear and reappear? When it reappeared, was it different? What were all the social dynamics behind this evolution? Because it's fascinating, and I think it could be a meta study of ontology. So throwing that idea out there.
So
but the other thing that I've thought about.
Sorry, continue.
Sorry, go ahead. The other thought is a bit.
Hang on, we'll close that. It would be fascinating, although it might be personally embarrassing.
Well, we've heard of egoless programming, so we need some egoless ontology. But it's actually, it's the history of an idea, or really the history of a very concrete set of ideas. And I think it would be a fascinating intellectual history. And of course, it's going to be rife with blind alleys and second guessing, but that's what makes it interesting. And I don't think you should be embarrassed at all, Dave, because I think GIST is a great improvement over what we had before, which were giant ontologies that nobody could use. But that leads me to my second point, which is a bit contrarian, which I've mused about. The line graph of this data is fascinating because it looks like GIST is stabilizing around 140 classes. And the limiting factor really seems to be what the limiting factor would be in the size of a software module or code module, which is how much one human can keep in his head at one time. Mm-hmm. And for better or worse, what we're saying is we're limiting gist to be that which one can comprehend and keep in his head at one time. And that has the positives we've been talking about. The analogy is useful. But it has the negative that perhaps we're leaving things out that should be in there because we begin to overload our brains. And that makes me wonder if we should come up with some kind of a structure that allows us to build something on top of GIST other than our many client-specific, application-specific ontologies. It's just a thought. I just want to throw it out there. But you know, if the principle that limits the size of GIST is how much we can keep in our heads, then I think of the software development principle of having modules, and maybe, you know, when GIST becomes stable enough, people will be able to build more general purpose ontologies that are not quite, you know, the top level upper ontology that GIST is, but maybe one level down, that just assumes that everything in GIST is concrete and known, and you can just assume it's there and build on it. We're doing that at the application level, but I'm wondering what general concepts we're leaving out.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a
great observation. If I could just comment a couple of things there. One, the limit of what you can keep in your head is 7 plus or minus 2. But as Simon and I just
yeah,
what architects know, that, and the reason they have these big pieces of paper is you can keep in your head what you can put on one E6 size diagram, which probably is roughly this amount. So that's, you know, just an observation. Second observation, it is pretty modular, but almost as we've been seeing, another evolution that'd be interesting is everything keeps getting pushed up to the top because it's referred to in more than one module. So that's a force that's kind of going. And my third thought, I think we're dead on. We're kind of working on industry-specific GIST modules. So there'll be things like in the healthcare industry that not everyone wants to share. So we should keep them out of GIST core, but have them in healthcare, for instance.
Yeah, I think that's extremely sound. I mean, people complain of bloat when there's too much undifferentiated. You know, people complain that Emacs is a bloated editor, but that's because there's a lot of scripts inside. Nobody complains that Bash is a bloated shell because there are thousands and thousands of scripts for it. It's a computer programming analogy. Yeah, you can say the same sort of thing about books. I mean, a book that's 5 inches thick, no one can handle. But, you know, 50 books modularly separated, you know, are of the same, with the same total volume, are more manageable. So the emphasis has to be, I think, on a functional decomposition. Put something in a module if it is not of interest to all, or even if it is of interest to all, but it can be separated. We can say, well, yes, when you need to open this book, here it is.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I had a second point. Wait a minute. Yeah, modules, and then I'll when I think of it, I'll flag again.
Yeah, I've actually done some analyses on customer data for some of our customers where I've distilled both instance and taxonomy, you know, CBOX data down to relationships between classes, and then rendered it using you know, force-based layouts to let naturally correlated concepts coalesce to identify clusters of things, and tend to say this is a candidate for being enclosed in a sub-ontology. These are related concepts that usually co-occur, and just as a way of exploring, and you know, any graph algorithm for natural cluster identification is a less visual way of identifying same, and you can use it, you know, come up with criteria that you can refine of if these classes really only occur together, tend to be related either only to each other or the upper ontology, then they are a natural sub-ontology, partition them into their own domain. And, you know, and it also is a way of managing, because to some extent the bloat is for a very large number of concepts, whereas perhaps a smaller number of concepts with facets is a better way of expressing the same thing. We don't have a different word for a toy of every color, right? We just have a color and a toy. But if your upper level ontology starts getting to where it itself is decomposable, then it has gotten too large. And you're including things in there just for convenience. And that's one of the reasons that we have been applying. We've actually spent quite a lot of time during the release cycle of this version of GIST at looking at ontology metrics and trying to kind of critically examine GIST as well as some other ontologies to make sure that we are following at least pretty good practices as far as conciseness and clarity and targeting stability as well, which is what you were indicating previously. Is in order for us to serve as a good foundation for domain-specific ontologies, we have to provide a clean, solid, relatively stable foundation.
Greg was asking in the chat whether or not there had been any analysis between the stable classes and the volatile ones, and this is hot off the press. Greg, I'm afraid we haven't had a chance to get down to that level of detail, but as Boris was pointing out, these are the sort of things that would be of interest, because we expect minimalism and stability to be key features of an upper level ontology. There are probably only about 3 or 4 minutes left of the meeting.
I thought of that. I think you've done an amazing job in navigating not only away from the, tyranny of enterprise applications, but also the tyranny of philosophical underpinnings. You managed to dispose of those very nicely by just looking at that and saying, we're not going there.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
No velleities in our ontology.
Okay, last couple of minutes. Would anybody like to chip in anything before I close the meeting for this month? In that case, I would like to thank everybody for the time. I would also remind you that we have got the GitHub, which is there for discussions and for the resolution of issues. I will ensure that we get this distributed to council members, and look forward to chatting with you at the next meeting. Dave, is there anything that you would like to say in conclusion?
I was just going to say that was excellent, very thought-provoking. I love this walk down history lane here.
Okay,
cheerio. Share that history spreadsheet.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks.